Okay, I'm back for another lecture. Um, and I would like to make this one a lot briefer than the last one. I just want to talk about the different genres of literature. And I want to talk about the ways in which all the poems fit into the different poems and plays and novel, the way they fit into these genres. Um, and and then I want to give an introduction to the Homeric world, the world of Homer, not a lengthy one, but a short one. And then I want to talk about the Iliad, Homer and Homer's Iliad, as a segue into the Odyssey. Okay, so um, as I pointed out in the last lecture, there are three basic forms of literature. Literature is defined as a work of fiction, right? It's an imaginative work of of art. It's not history. Um, even if there's such a thing as like a historical novel, the actions are made up generally of characters that might be historical, but the actions themselves um, are fictional, not necessarily historically accurate. Okay, so as I pointed out, um, you know there are there are works of literature that are narrative. They tell a story. They have a plot, a beginning, middle, and end, and that's what we have with the text we're reading. I was going to try to put different kinds of poems in here that are not narratives. Um, for example, the sonnet doesn't tell a story. It gives a kind of crystallized, uh, uh, formal articulation of sets of feelings or ideas. Um, Lyric poetry is a lengthy exposition and expression of feelings. We're not going to be dealing with poems like that, poems that are not narrative. So we're dealing with narrative fiction, and we're dealing with three different forms. We're dealing with, first of all, poetry, um, and we're reading an epic poem. So there are really only a few epic poems in the history of Western literature. Homer happened to write two of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then Virgil imitated that, uh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, at around the year 30 BC. He was a Roman, so wrote in Latin, and he wrote an epic poem about the founding of Rome, the fictional founding of Rome by a character named Aeneas. Um, and then we have Dante's Divine Comedy is sometimes referred to as an epic poem, but I don't think of it. I don't really think of it as an epic poem, but um, certainly Milton's Paradise Lost is an epic poem. Probably the only great epic poem in English literature. Um, so uh, you know, there have been tries at epic poems. The epic poem cannot be really written anymore, because it depends upon a kind of shared agreement about what the culture is, and we don't have a shared agreement about what Western culture is anymore. The time of Homer could agree about the values and the meaning of Greek culture. Um, Even at the time of Milton's Paradise Lost, there were breaks already, but I think generally everyone would have accepted the general outline of what Milton was saying. They might have disagreed about the details, but they didn't reject, in general, Milton's idea of Christianity there. Um, but we don't have that unified view, so epic poetry is not written anymore. Um, it also requires, it also is a kind of summary of the culture. Who could possibly summarize all of the culture? History, science, literature. Science would have to be included. It's part of the knowledge of the culture. So you can't write an epic poem anymore. So when we're reading a poem like the Odyssey, it really is an articulation of the entire culture. So we're getting into the culture. We're seeing how the culture. Um, so the Odyssey is the first poem we're going to be reading. And then we'll be reading Beowulf is another narrative poem, much shorter than the Odyssey, and it too is a kind of articulation of a kind of the medieval culture at the time, but I'll leave that a little later. Poetry is defined, I would say this, its lowest level definition is that rather than writing words out and just having them in block print, right? That's prose. Poetry breaks things up according to line units. And it can do it in any way at once. But you have to scan and go to the end of the lines, and it has a pattern on the page. You can look at it and see what a poem looks different than prose. It generally has a kind of a rhythm to it. In other words, you can discern a kind of beat, a set of beats, a kind of regularized rhythm. That is not entirely true of all poetry, but poetry tends to have a rhythm, what's called meter, right? You can discern a certain pattern in the line itself and across lines. Poetry is not defined by rhyming. We generally think of a poem as rhymed. The Odyssey does not have rhymes. Its organizational structure is organized by sound. Poetry is written to the ear. Prose not so much, but to the mind. Comprehension. Poetry really asks you to hear it. You should read it out loud, actually. Its sound is very important. So if you read it out loud, you'll be able to hear it. Beowulf has a different kind of sound structure, very highly more regularized than the Odyssey. So there are a number of different kinds of poems. Epic, there's lyric poetry, there's the sonnet, as I pointed out, there's the ode, there's the elegy, there's the couplet. The Beowulf poem is more like an elegy. It's a long poem bemoaning the loss of a great pagan warrior and king named Beowulf. So it's an elegy. And we're not going to read these other different kinds of poems. I would say the Odyssey pretty much has all of the elements that we would find in poems. It's got images, it's got similes, it's got ways of speaking that are representational or rhetorical, that really give us an idea of what poetry is all about. So same is true of Beowulf. So drama is written and written down. It's meant to be performed on the stage by characters. But we will be reading Hamlet, we'll be reading Antigone and Oedipus. They have been performed, they were performed. They're largely spectacles. They're meant to be observed and seen as a spectacle on the stage. Spectacle comes from spect, which is to see, to but we are going to read them as works of literature. One of the major differences, we can stop and reread lines said by characters. But you can't do that when you're watching it on stage. They're not going to make the actor stop. Hey, stop and tell me what you said before. That's the difference. It's real time. And we don't have the character interpreting it. We don't have the character up on stage. There are ways of saying lines on stage that make you think one thing or another, and certain actors are brilliant at bringing certain things out. They already interpret. Hamlet is highly interpretable for us. Antigone is as well. Oedipus is as well. We have to think into them. We're not told what they're thinking. We have to think into them, what they say and do on the stage. So drama is the second genre. It's either tragic, comic, or history. History those plays, there's a lot of Shakespeare plays, their histories, but the two forms in general are tragic and comic. Tragedy starts at a very high place, ends at the lowest depths with terrible suffering. Comedy begins with chaos and ends by a kind of happy ending. We're not going to be reading any comedies. We're reading three really, really terrible. Sorry, I laugh. Just horrible endings. These plays, just horrific. Sorry, that's the nature of tragedy. Okay. So let me introduce. I'll introduce each of the genres. This is the modern fiction, early 18th century. Flannery O'Connor, the novel we're reading is a mid 20th century novel, American novel about the American South, which is where she grew up in Georgia. She knows the area, and that's what she writes about. So, okay, let me introduce the Odyssey. It's an epic poem. It encapsulates, articulates all of the great cultural ideas and elements. To get a full picture of the Homeric world and Greek culture at this time, we need to actually read the Iliad. That's about war, but we don't have time for both of those, so we're only going to do the Odyssey. But you get enough of in the Odyssey to understand what Greek culture is all about. So it's a lengthy narrative poem. It tells a story. All right. It's written in a particular meter, which is the iambic hexameter, which means there are 6 feet. But at that, he bellowed out to Lord Poseidon. That's why I just opened that and just read a line. You can hear da 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 da. So it's written in units of 6 feet. You can see units of 6 feet. Now it doesn't always have the same meter. Da 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 da. It doesn't always have that. You can't sustain it like that, but that's the basic foot. It's called iambic. It's an iamb, da da. You can see it. It's largely sometimes called ascending because it's da da. You'll hear it kind of lilt up. And again, not every set of syllables is that way, but that's the basic foot or the form. So there's 6 feet in a line. Every line has 6 feet. Okay. It's based upon, because it's an epic, it's based upon heroic characters. So the Odyssey is based upon Odysseus. He's a great heroic figure. He is a deeply flawed hero. Deeply flawed. He messes up big time. And that's part of the greatness, is that out of that mess, he's able to emerge in some way. So it deals with a heroic figure. It deals with a grand scale or setting. The Iliad deals with the fall of Troy, one of the great moments, by the way, seemingly historical. They've been able to uncover the walls of Troy and pretty much see that there was a battle there. That probably the events of Achilles and the rest of that stuff is not historically, accurate. It's an epic, and it's a work of fiction. But it tells of the great military exploits of Greece, and within that shows their greatness. It shows what heroism is, what courage is. The Odyssey is the tale of going back home. It's largely about the effects of war and what it means to have a civilized culture. It tells the beginning of civilization, of Greek civilization at the end, the founding of it, with Athena showing up at the end. So the grand scale of action heroic. The Odyssey deals probably um, scholars have been able to detect what islands um, um, Odysseus landed on. The island of Calypso is Malta, the island of Malta, which I've been to twice. It's an amazing place. Um, it's right just off the coast of Africa in the Mediterranean, but it's largely considered a European country. Um, it's part of the EU. So the grand scale of action is all of the Mediterranean Sea. All of the known world is the Mediterranean Sea. So um, this uh, uh, follows the margin, to the very margins of the known world in a fictive way. Okay, so grand scope of action. It 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 has a number of. You could always count on an epic poem to have what's called the Deus ex machina. That's the Latin for the God out of the machine. So there's a lot of divine intervention. Odysseus will be aided by divine help. The Iliad is filled with gods helping men on the battlefield. Not so much in the Odyssey, but it's there. So the Greek world believes in gods intervening to help men at various times, help men and women at various times. The style is very grand and ceremonial. It's very formal. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of cause to let your guard down in terms. It's high style. It's high subject matter, important subject matter. It's a high style. There are funny things about it, though. I should say there are funny things. So you should pay attention to those. But those are always set in a formal setting with a formal style of writing. Okay. All right. So that's what to look forward to. Those are the characteristics of an epic. Familiarize. Again, you should be taking notes, but you should especially be taking notes about the 4 conventions of an epic. Conventions. Convention. 4 conventions. You're going to have these 4 things in every epic poem. One of them at the very outset is the invocation of the muse, along with the statement of the argument. These 2 things go hand in hand. The poet will invoke the muse. Please, God, come and help me, inspire me, use me to speak this great, grand thing. It shows that the subject matter is above, in some ways, human comprehension and human creativity. One of the fictions of, which I don't think they thought of as fictions, but one of the things that epic poems do is always appeal to the gods or to God. Milton appeals to the Holy Spirit to inspire the poet to write what is true, what is above comprehension. So it appeals to that, and the statement of the argument tells what the poem is about. Right? Tells what the poem is about. So it'll be about Odysseus, what happened to him on his travels back from Troy to Ithaca. So invocation of the muse, statement of the argument, convention number 1. Number 2, it always begins in medias res. That's a Latin term. In medias res means in the middle of things. So the Odyssey actually begins near the very end of his 10-year journey on the way back to Ithaca. What happens to him over those almost 10 years is told by Odysseus himself, largely. Okay, he tells the stories. And then the second, that's in the first 12 books. The second 12 books, what happens to him when he arrives at Ithaca is told by the poet. Okay, so in Medes Res begins in the middle of things. It allows Odysseus himself to tell some stories. Okay, so we have to interpret his stories. That's a very interesting thing to do. Convention number 2 begins in the middle of things, in Medes Res. Convention number 3, there are always sets of places in a poem where you have a catalog of characters, a whole list of characters. This is done in the Iliad many times, the Odyssey not so much. But the catalog of characters lists things, a list of things. And then I'm not going to pay too much attention to that because it seems minor. But the last convention, again, it's just Homer is epic similes. This thing is like this thing. Odysseus's handling of arms was like a whirlwind. That's an epic simile. You compare one thing to another, and it's lengthy. An epic simile extends over a couple of lines long. So statement of argument, invocation of the muse is convention number 1. Beginning in Medes Res, in the middle of things, is convention number 2. Catalog of characters, convention number 3. Using epic similes is convention number 4. Why are they conventions? Because Homer did them. Homer made use of these kinds of conventions. And anything that pretends to be an epic poem has to imitate what Homer did. Homer could have not done this. It's a convention. It was done by Homer, and Homer is the founder of the epic. So that's what we have in epic poems. They're not some natural law. It's what Homer did, and it does seem to follow organically out of epic. It works with the epic form, but it is a convention. Okay, the Homeric world in general. The historical fall of Troy is at probably between 1334 to 1150 BC, so 200 years. It's unclear. It happened in Asia Minor, I believe in Macedonia. So Greece would be in the eastern part of the Mediterranean and the Ionian Sea. And the Adriatic, and you would go even further east through the sea. I've forgotten which sea that is. It might be the Ionian Sea. Through to Asia Minor, and that's where Troy is. It's a different culture. The Trojans are not Greeks, even though they seem to follow and believe in the same gods that the Greeks do. So that's the historical basis of it. The composition. The dating of the composition of the poem is around 850 BC. It's not clear the exact time of composition. It is based, the Homeric epics are based upon an oral tradition. In other words, what it means is that the narrative story would have been told and told over and over again, and eventually committed to writing. There is a new theory about this that I recently read in a new translation of the Homeric epics, which argues that the Greek alphabet was actually created for the purposes of an epic poem. This has very important cultural implications, and for Western culture and for us as well, that I think we should keep in mind. And that is that it wasn't created for the purposes of commerce. Language is for the purpose of culture and for the purpose of conveying emotion, meaning, significance. And it could be argued that commerce arises on the basis of culture first. So as we live through the coronavirus, we should maintain our culture. We should read works of literature, great works of literature. We should pay attention to art, because that won't fail, and we might need that as the economy spirals downwards and perhaps collapses. Right? It doesn't mean the collapse of our culture, as long as we keep the culture alive. So I think we're doing a very important thing in this course by reading Greek literature. This is not negligible. This is an important aspect of maintaining our humanity and our humaneness. I think to read the Odyssey is to peer into the very origins of our culture. Western cultures, especially American culture, is built upon the edifice of Greek literature and philosophy, and mythology, but largely Greek literature and philosophy. So it's to look back at the roots of our own culture and to see how those are living in our culture right now, and a way to reclaim them in a way. The narrative of the Odyssey, of the Iliad, the Odyssey, would have been based upon, again, as I said, an oral tradition. It would have been derived from the past that gives it a kind of historical depth, that's kind of quasi-historical, but also provides a kind of mythological element that grounds the historical past. So all ancient cultures have a myth, and all have a creative myth. By the way, all ancient cultures also have a legend of creation and an original state of perfection from which man fell. And also all of these great cultures separately have a story of a flood, of an epic flood that seemed to have destroyed the cultures. So there's a lot of similarities. Greek culture has it too, in a particular way. So has a kind of mythological origin, a kind of quasi-historical past. The characters themselves are stylized figures. They are representative of ideal types. So Odysseus, really, more than Achilles, who was a great figure in the Iliad, he's a figure really of destruction of the culture. He's bloodthirsty and doesn't even mind if all of the Greeks are killed, as long as he comes out and he's the great hero. He wants glory. There is an element of glory in Greek culture, but Achilles, the great figure of the Iliad, is not really a great figure of held up as a great figure. He's more of a kind of aberration of glory. Odysseus is witty, can tell stories. By the way, the way that Troy fell is through Odysseus. It took a trick to defeat the Trojans. They were never going to defeat them. It took a trick. The Trojan horse. Everybody knows about the Trojan horse. Odysseus is the one who created that. So he's clever. He's a trickster. He's courageous. He can get out of things. But it's really his supple wit that makes him an exemplary Greek figure. So we are really reading, I think, the center of Greek culture when we look at the Odyssey. I think it's much more representative of the Greek culture than the Iliad is. Okay, so again, the creation of the Greek alphabet is probably the most important event in Western civilization. It begins the writing, the ability to write, and it was developed. The Greek alphabet was developed to create the Homeric epics, and probably I think the argument had been made that it allowed for the possibility then of commerce, because then you could write things down and record how much was being traded and you could develop an economy based upon records, right? So this is a very interesting point, again, that I want to make. Okay. Links between the Iliad and the Odyssey, just to prepare you to, because it is starting in medias res, right? It's starting in the middle of things. Clear links between the two. Greek military action of Troy. That leads to the actions that Odysseus performs. The 10 years of fighting in Troy lead to 10 years of wandering. They've created a problem in Odysseus, and we'll see this as we move through the story. 10 years of war have not been helpful, right? So the key idea that links the two is hubris or pride. When a Greek succumbs to hubris or pride, they are calling down the wrath of the gods. Why? Because they're forgetting that they owe everything to the gods. That the gods giveth and the gods taketh away. Right? So when hubris rears its ugly head, it's when human beings are forgetful that they are below the gods. And they kind of put themselves in the level of gods. The gods don't like that. The gods want worship, and they strike human beings down all the time when that happens. So the element of hubris and pride that will be picked up in Oedipus Tyrannus and Antigone. It's a central Greek idea. It's a central human idea. It's one of the key links between Greek culture and Christianity. Okay. Athena's major role as the defender of the Greeks in the Iliad. Whenever Athena gets fully involved in the battle at Troy, the Greeks are winning. If she's off being distracted by somebody else, maybe Zeus has told her to get out of the way. Zeus can tell her to get out of the way. When he does that, the Trojans start winning. So she's a great defender of the Greeks in the Trojan War. She's the goddess of ingenuity and the goddess of cleverness. She's the goddess of law. She's the goddess of all kinds of elements of cleverness, thought. Her role in both of these Homeric poems is key. Zeus is the arbiter of justice, right? So he kind of makes everything equal on the level of battle. When it comes to the Odyssey, he's the one that oversees the guest-host relationship. And I'll talk about that in the context of the poem. But he's really important here, standing above all of these other things. Athena gets in there and helps Odysseus figure things out on a concrete level. Zeus rules over the exchange of the guest-host relationship. And okay. What are the key themes? Wandering, homecoming. When you're wandering, it's because you're led astray from your goal. The goal is to get home. If you're wandering, you're not going home. You're doing something else. The effects of war upon civilization. They affect Odysseus. They affect Ithaca when Odysseus returns. This is something to always keep in mind. War is a bad thing. It affects the victors in horrible ways, not just those who lose. It's called trauma, right? We'll see Odysseus suffers from trauma. The treatment of visitors, guests, I've talked about that. Pride, hubris, reverence for the gods. These are all key themes in the Odyssey. Pay attention to them. Look for them as you're reading. As you're reading, try to jot things down that you see that are important in that regard. And I think you'll be able to see patterns very quickly as you're reading. Um, so that's an introduction to genres of literature, the Homeric world, and uh, and the Odyssey in particular. I would start reading, and if, as you're reading, please feel free to email me any questions you have about this particular talk. Um, the next thing you'll see in terms of a video recording will be an actual lecture on the Odyssey itself.